Good morning, good afternoon,
and good evening. Thank you for joining us for today's launch webinar of the report Achieving Net Zero Carbon Emissions in Switzerland in 2050, Low Carbon Scenarios and Their System Costs. It is now my pleasure to introduce William D. Magwood IV, Director General of the Nuclear Energy Agency, the NEA, for his preliminary remarks. Following Mr. Magwood's remarks, NEA Chief Economist Jan Horst Kepler will lead you through the remainder of the webinar.
Good afternoon. I'm Bill Magwood. I'm Director General of the OECD Nuclear Energy Agency. It's my true pleasure to invite you to this webinar, Achieving Net Zero Carbon Emissions in Switzerland in 2050. This webinar will present the results of some analysis that we've done at the NEA that calls upon some proprietary work that we've done over the course of years looking at system cost analyses. You're going to hear a lot more detail about this in a few minutes. But first, let me give you a bit of an overview about why this sort of study is important right now. As we look around the world, and particularly in the world that the NEA exists in, where we work with energy policy experts and officials from around our member countries and indeed around the world, we find that we are living in a very complex and profoundly changed world when it comes to energy. Just a few years ago, the biggest conversation in energy circles was about how to achieve carbon emissions as quickly and cost effectively as possible. While that's still high on the agenda, the energy crisis that many countries live in today have given a much greater emphasis to energy security. And so this has changed the conversation quite substantially. Following the COP26 meetings that took place in Glasgow, we saw that there was a lot of concern about the strategies that many countries were taking to achieve net zero. And this became even more magnified in the aftermath of the events in Ukraine. With energy security, challenges to the climate agenda both being discussed around the world, analysis becomes very important to understand what our options are and how much it will cost to be effective in reducing carbon emissions over the course of the next few decades. As the NEA has analyzed the situation, we found that when you consider both electricity generation and growing electricity demand from electrification of transportation and other factors, the need for carbon-free process heat for industry, for hydrogen production, we add all that together, we find that it's important to see a tripling of nuclear capacity around the world by 2050 in order to meet climate mitigation targets. That is a very heavy lift in many ways. And it shows that we cannot rely on really any one technology to achieve our goals. We are going to have to use a wide range of technologies, both nuclear technologies and non-nuclear technologies. But to triple nuclear capacity, we are going to need new technologies, small modular reactors, Gen 4 reactors. We're going to need to build in many countries large light water reactors, Gen 3 technologies. But the beginning of the conversation really is that we have to maintain our existing nuclear facilities as long as they are safe and economic. And this, I think, is a big part of the study you'll be hearing about. Now, it is true that the global fleet, when you take the average, is about 32 years old. In nuclear energy terms, that's actually not as old as many people might think. Analysis that we published in just the last couple of years demonstrates that there's really very rarely technical barriers to extending the lives of nuclear power plants. These facilities really can operate for 50, 60, 70, 80 years, and some people think even longer, very safely, very cost effectively. With proper maintenance and refurbishments, long-term operation of the existing fleet is actually the single most competitive source of low-carbon electricity available to us. A study that we performed just a few years ago in cooperation with the International Energy Agency shows that the existing nuclear power plants are our cheapest source of low-carbon electricity. So it's very important to keep this resource available as we try to abate carbon. Now, and often we find that the analysis that some countries have run to look at their energy options tend to not fully appreciate the effect that long-term operation can have on their calculations. We have been leading the study of system-level methodologies for more than a decade to understand the true cost of electricity generation. We have many reports and analyses on this, and I commend you to our website to understand it better. But the essence is that if you look at simply the plant level cost of any source of electricity generation, you're going to miss the full picture. To see the full picture, you have to look at the impact on the overall electricity system, the whole system. And what we have found, and I think the most important aspect of what we found in the analysis, and maybe the most important insight, is that it's impossible to have a one-size-fits-all approach to the lowest cost of low carbon generation long-term across the world. You have to look at an economy by economy, country by country basis to fully understand how a particular country can most effectively reduce its CO2 emissions and maintain a reliable electricity system. That's why country-specific studies looking at the cost of generating electricity are so important. And that's why we're so pleased about presenting this webinar today to talk about the analysis we've done in cooperation with our colleagues in Switzerland. Looking at a specific country case is essential to understand what these costs truly are, because there are very important local factors that go into all these analyses. And Switzerland is a fantastic example to start with. Switzerland has many, many attributes that are both unique and advantageous when it comes to reducing CO2 emissions. Switzerland is a bit of a hub within the European community. It is a country that benefits from a tremendous amount of both imports and export capacity, which give it great flexibility that is really not available to most other countries. And also, and very importantly, and the analysis really highlights this, Switzerland's large hydroelectric capacity gives it the ability to reduce CO2 emissions in a way that is simply impossible for most other countries. So we're going to go into a lot of detail about this, so I won't spend much time on it, but these two factors play very large in the analysis that you're going to hear about today. And I think I would recommend to you that as you listen to this, to think about countries that don't have the interconnection that Switzerland has, and countries that don't have the hydro capacity that Switzerland has, and think about how much more complex these calculations would be to reduce CO2 emissions without those attributes. And even in the case of Switzerland, there are still cautionary notes, which we will talk about. Now, we certainly hope that this study, which is really the very first that we've applied publicly to a country-specific case using our methodology, we certainly hope that this will provide all of our listeners today with tremendous insights into these complex issues. And also for our colleagues in Switzerland, insights into how their specific case could be impacted by various policy approaches. My thanks to the NEA team that produced this report, led by our chief economist, Jan Horst Kepler, who you'll hear from in just a few minutes. And also my thanks to our colleagues at Swiss Nuclear, who funded this study and provided a great deal amount of information, as well as Alpic, the Swiss electricity supplier. We received a lot of data that was important in producing the study. And we also appreciated the reviews that we received from a scientific advisory council under the chair of Marco Anunde. So there's a lot of people who participated in this, and we're very pleased with the results, because I think it does show the power of these country-specific analyses. So as we go forward with this webinar, I hope you will listen carefully and understand that you're listening to a specific country case. And again, commend you to really think carefully about what happens in the cases of countries that don't have the benefits of large hydro capacity and large electricity transmission, import and export. As we try to move towards net zero around the world, countries are going to be challenged more and more and more to achieve their targets. And in our analysis, nuclear capacity, both from long-term operation existing facilities and new facilities, are going to be absolutely essential globally for if we're going to be able to achieve our carbon emissions reductions targets. So with that, I will pass the floor to my colleagues to begin the description of this analysis, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts as we go forward. And for countries that wish to perform this analysis with us, please reach out to us. We're very happy to work with countries around the world to do analysis like this, because it builds our insights as well as we go forward in trying to support our member countries to reach net zero by 2050. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Bill Magwood for these scene-setting remarks on the importance of reducing carbon emissions, the role of nuclear power in this context, and also on the importance of country-specific factors. Thank you very much, Bill. We will now switch to Diane Cameron, the head of the NTE division, the Division on Nuclear Technology Development and Economics of the NEA, in which this study was indeed prepared. And she will prepare some remarks, share some remarks on the NEA system cost work more specifically. So please, over to Diane.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Diane Cameron. It's my privilege to serve as the head of Nuclear Technology Development and Economics at the Nuclear Energy Agency, and my pleasure today to provide some brief introductory remarks for today's session. I'd like to use this time to introduce the Nuclear Energy Agency's approach to understanding the costs of electricity, which requires a systems-level perspective. The concepts I'm going to cover in my brief remarks today create, hopefully, a bit of a foundation for the launch of the NEA's newest report in this area, entitled Achieving Net Zero Carbon Emissions in Switzerland, Low Carbon Scenarios and Their System Costs. My short presentation is structured in three parts. First, I'd like to define some key terminology, which creates a basis then for understanding some general concepts. And I'll conclude by introducing the Swiss study, which will be presented in greater detail by Jan Horst Kepler, the NEA's chief economist, a little later in today's session. The first thing I'd like to do is introduce a framework for thinking about the costs of electricity. At the center, first, we have what we call plant level costs of generation, which include, amongst other costs, the costs of actual concrete and steel used to build the plant, as well as fuel, human resources, and other operational costs at the plant level. When we talk about levelized costs of electricity, or LCOE, that's what we're usually talking about. We're usually talking about plant level costs, although sometimes LCOE calculations can include some externalities that have been internalized into plant level costs. For example, if there's a price on carbon or a legislated requirement to internalize end of life cycle costs into operating costs. Next in the diagram, so we enlarge the circle one little bit, we see grid level costs. And these are the costs of generating units impose on the broader system, including the costs of delivering electricity from generating plants to customers, in other words, connection, distribution, and transmission costs. Equally importantly, grid level costs include the costs associated with compensating for the variability and uncertainty in supply from generating plants. And this includes, for example, the costs of maintaining spinning reserves or additional dispatchable capacity that can be ramped up when variable sources are unavailable. And lastly, if we draw our system boundary at the maximum extent, we have social and environmental costs that different technologies impose on the well-being of people and communities, including negative externalities like pollution and climate change, as well as some positive externalities such as employment and economic development or spin-off benefits from technology innovation. These are the externalities that are not accounted for in plant level LCOE or grid level costs. The point here is to establish a framework that allows us to compare the costs of different generating options, such that we're comparing apples to apples, not apples to oranges. And that requires systems level thinking and a systems level perspective. We define total system costs then as the plant level generating costs plus grid level system costs. Taking this systems level perspective factors in profile costs, the grid level costs imposed by variability or intermittency, balancing costs, the grid level costs imposed by uncertainty in generation, as well as connection, distribution, and transmission costs. In other words, the costs of delivering electricity from distributed power generation to customers. And to be clear, intermittent, variable, and uncertain sources of power generation impose greater grid level system costs, which is why it is so important to take a systems level perspective when comparing costs of variable renewables with nuclear, baseload hydro, and fossil generation. In other words, it is systems level analysis that allows us to compare apples to apples. Having set out this framework for thinking about the costs of different generating options, I'd like to now present the key findings from a joint NEA-IEA report on the projected costs of electricity. Analysis of costs from more than 20 IEA and NEA member countries led us to the notable conclusion that the lowest cost option for generating electricity is long-term operations of nuclear power plants. Equally notable is the finding about the range of costs for solar and wind generation, which depend heavily on regional endowments and conditions. And if you'd like to unpack these figures a little further, we invite you to check out our LCOE calculator on the IEA NEA website, where you can play with the key parameters and assumptions. And we trust that you will find, as we did, that our key findings here are robust. And these findings have significant policy implications. In reality, though, most grids around the world include a mix of generating sources. So it's not just a question of comparing the costs of one option against the other, but we have to look at how they integrate together. So I'd like to now look at a total at the total costs for a range of scenarios, ranging from our base case here with 0% variable renewables, then introducing 10% variable renewables, 50% variable renewables, up to 75% variable renewables in the mix. As the share of variable renewables increases, so too do total costs rise. Average plant level costs rise, though this finding depends somewhat on regional endowments, which we saw in the last slide. But more importantly, system costs grow significantly as the growing share of variable renewables imposes greater costs on the grid for stability and flexibility. In the left-hand graph, you can see the breakdown of system costs as the share of variable renewables grows from 10% to 75% in the mix. This includes profile costs to compensate for variability and intermittency, connection, distribution, and transmission costs, and balancing costs to compensate for uncertainty. A key finding here is that profile costs to compensate for variability and intermittency are the dominant driver of increasing total costs as the share of variable renewables grows. So pulling this all together, to understand the costs of electricity provision requires systems level thinking. And when policymakers and decision makers try to take decisions by comparing power generating costs on the basis of LCOE, or levelized cost of electricity, they are comparing only plant level costs. They are not taking into account grid level or systems level costs. In other words, comparing options on the basis of LCOE alone is like comparing apples to oranges, and this can lead to bad decisions because it is incomplete information. So you might ask, why do so many policymakers and decision makers use LCOE then? And the answer is because it is a very straightforward calculation. Unfortunately, it paints an incomplete picture because it does not include all of the grid level costs associated with transmission and distribution, but more importantly, it does not include the grid level costs associated with compensating for variability and uncertainty. And let there be no doubt, variable renewable sources of power impose substantively greater system level costs on the grid. On this slide, you see a 3D graph. The vertical axis is the total cost of electricity based on system level analysis. The axis heading off to the right ranges from low shares of variable renewables in the mix, starting at 0, to high shares of variable renewables in the mix, reaching a maximum of about 80%. And the axis heading off to the left is a carbon constraint on the system, ranging from no constraint on carbon in the dark blue zone to a net zero carbon constraint along the red line at the back. And there really are two key takeaways from this graph. The first one is that higher shares of variable renewables impose higher system costs and drive total costs up. And you can see this by looking at the green line that cuts the graph around 50 grams per carbon per kilowatt hour. And the second key finding on this graph is that the most important is probably the most important takeaway here. Look at what happens when we take that 50 grams per kilowatt hour green line and we push the carbon constraint back to zero, the red line at about close, just shy of 1 gram of carbon per kilowatt hour. The relationship between high shares of variable renewables and total costs becomes even more pronounced. And that's because the options for backing up variable renewables become increasingly expensive in a carbon constrained world, where you have to take even natural gas offline. Now, what I've described so far today are general concepts, and there are some universal truths here. Increasing penetration of variable renewables in the mix causes system costs to rise. Increasing carbon constraints can also cause system costs to rise. But the extent of these effects depends on country-specific considerations. In other words, we expect that this 3D graph will always have an S-shaped curve on the cost mix axis and an exponential curve on the cost carbon axis. But precisely where the point of inflection in that S shape occurs on the cost mix axis, and precisely where the hockey stick bend occurs on the cost carbon axis depends. And consequently, so does the height of the peak. These things depend on country-specific conditions. So even though there are some universal truths to these relationships between share of variable renewables, carbon constraints, and total system costs, it's important to carry out country-specific system studies in order to fully characterize and quantify the costs of electricity in different settings. And we were delighted to have the opportunity to complete such a study for Switzerland, which is unique in many ways, with an already largely decarbonized grid, extensive interconnections to neighboring countries, significant potential for pumped hydro storage, and practical limitations on wind and solar deployment. Shortly, you'll hear from the NEA Chief Economist Jan Horst Kepler, who will present the details of the Swiss system cost study. We hope that you find it as interesting as we did. We look forward to working with many of you in the coming year on new system cost studies in additional jurisdictions and countries. Thank you. That concludes my portion of today's presentation.
Thank you to Jan Cameron, head of the NTE division, for these remarks on the NEA system cost work and setting the scene for the Swiss study that I now have the pleasure to present to you. So now we come to the NEA report, Achieving Net Carbon Emissions in Switzerland in 2050. Low carbon scenarios and the system cost. We can move on immediately to the outline in order not to lose any further time. The challenges of achieving net zero carbon emissions in the context of the Swiss electricity system will be the first part. Then I will talk a little bit about the model and the modeling effort that we employed. Then we'll come, of course, to the results of the study. And we'll finish with some conclusions. The next slide will put a little bit the Swiss policy context. Most of you are probably aware that Switzerland is committed to achieve net zero carbon emissions in 2050. A key question in that context is the role of nuclear power. Two popular initiatives in Switzerland have voted in favor of a ban on new nuclear new build, but against limiting the operations of existing nuclear power plants. So the lifetime of existing nuclear power plants is not limited in Switzerland. Just 4 short points. Current Swiss electricity mix strongly relies on hydroelectricity. Most observers expect a significant increase of variable renewable energy, in particular solar PV. Switzerland is closely interconnected to the surrounding European countries. There are many exchanges, both exports and imports in both directions. And finally, Switzerland, compared to other countries, the energy sector is not terribly electrified. And that would point towards an increase in the electricity demand. Now, the new report here on achieving net zero results from an innovative collaboration between the NEA and Switzerland. Bill Magwood has commented on this new form of cooperation, and we're really happy that Switzerland took the first step to explore this form of cooperation. And throughout the preparation of the report, we have really benefited from a continuous exchange between us at the NEA, the modeling team, in particular, Anne-Laure Mazurich and Guillaume Krivchik, Francesco Tassi, and myself, and Swiss stakeholders. I'd like to mention Roger Lundmark and Cedric Vessier in particular, but others have also contributed. And we received a lot of technical input and data from a management group of Swiss experts. The modeling approach and the methodology were regularly reviewed by a scientific advisory council. Marco Onedi was the chair. He was also mentioned by Bill Magwood, and we're very grateful for their contribution, which was very reassuring for us. And finally, there was a big study that came out last year in Switzerland, a collaborative study, JASM study, that was an important reference for our work, in particular with the modeling of demand. Just a quick overview: Swiss electricity system is already low carbon. Diane mentioned that, with a large share of hydropower. The darkest blue actually is the share of nuclear, but the next two big triangles or segments of the circle of the disk are actually hydro storage with reservoir and pump storage, almost 50% of capacity, and hydro run of river with another important chunk. So very hydro dominated. Some solar PV already, 14% of capacity, but 4% of generation mix. As usual, the capacity of solar is much higher than its contribution to the mix due to its variable nature. But most scenarios actually foresee a rise in the share of solar. In the next slide, actually, we do have an interview of the and a snapshot of the trade situation. Switzerland is located strategically between Austria, France, Germany, and Italy. 4 countries with very different generation mixes. It is thus a key platform for European electricity flows and trading. It earns significant trade revenues from this. We'll come to that later. And has very large interconnections. If you add up either the orange arrows or the blue arrows, you'll arrive at a number not far away from 10. And 10 gigawatts, that's also Swiss peak demand. And so that's quite unusual to have such high interconnections compared to peak demand. The official requirement by the European Union is 15%, and here we have 100%. And the major flexibility source that makes Switzerland such an interesting partner to trade with is, of course, hydroelectricity. This is sort of a state of the current discussion. There's a lively discussion in Switzerland and a well-informed discussion going on. And we're comparing here the results, some results of our report with the red frame there. 3 scenarios from our report with other reports that have been prepared in recent years in Switzerland. LTO stands for long-term operation scenario, with the long-term operation of the 2 youngest Swiss nuclear power plants. And VRE only scenario stands for variable renewables only scenario, i.e. only wind and solar will be added to the existing mix in order to achieve net zero. and nuke would refer to nuclear new build, 3.2 gigawatts, as sort of a contrasting case of new nuclear capacity. That's the dark blue share on the right that you see there, which is not in the other studies, which relied either on renewables, which are in green, light green, dark green, or on imports, which are in yellow, and on a lot of storage in orange. Well, so you see at the same time the specificity of our contribution, which is indeed looking at the potential contribution of nuclear, but also that our research to some extent is using or stays inside the parameters of the general discussion that is taking place in Switzerland, with the blue frame actually that is the JASM study. And overall, we have very similar demand structure. In particular, all the studies have between 80 and 90 terawatt hours in 2050. Next slide, please. This goes towards demand. Current demand 2019 is there in yellow. You have this characteristic rhythm of weekly demand, a little bit lower on the weekends, a little bit through the season, and so forth. In gray, you have the demand in 2050, and you see it will be much higher and much more volatile, which will mean higher costs and more difficult to achieve. And then you have the big difference on the left, LTO, with nuclear long-term operations and with interconnection capacity at today's levels, i.e. roughly 10 gigawatts. And on the right, you have a scenario with only variable renewables, 90% of those would be solar PV, in a scenario of autarky, no interconnections. And you see how the volatility increases enormously, mainly due to storage. We need to charge and discharge much more often, much more regularly in the VRE-only scenario under autarky than in an LTO scenario. This just to show how these assumptions really translate over the whole picture, i.e. in this case, the structure of demand. Next slide, please. Yes, the NEA POSY model, of which we are to some extent quite proud, POSY for power system. It's a linear programming model with the Gurobi solver. It minimizes, as these models do, the total cost of the electricity system, simultaneously optimizing the investment in the long term and the dispatch in the short term, subjected to a supply constraint, i.e. Energy services demand needs to be fulfilled at every single hour. Now the model is not only a linear programming model, but a mixed integer linear programming model, a MILP, which is the more realistic kind of model because it allows to model a number of technical constraints of the operations of the power system, such as startup patterns, minimum uptimes, downtimes, and so forth. And that improves realism considerably. And the third leg on which it stands is, of course, then the quality of the data, the specific technologies that are used in Switzerland, the costs, and of course, then the hourly time series, the demand I already mentioned, the production, solar, wind of renewables, and then, of course, a price series of the prices in the neighboring countries. And we had very good data on this, and thanks again to our interlocutors for those. Next slide, still on the modeling, on the validation. What's the validation? It basically makes sure that the model can reproduce a given historical year, in that case 2019. So the model really works and thinks such as the real Swiss model. And here two examples. On the left, we have the water levels in the hydro reservoirs, and on the right, nuclear power generation. And in yellow, it is the POSY model. In blue, it is the historical reference. And so just to show you, the model does work like the Swiss power sector. And that's very important to get the right results. mainly because of the correlation of time series. And so tweaking the model so that it works to reproduce a historical time series is an important step. Now we're coming really to the study and its result itself. We tested indeed 15 scenarios, as you can see on the next slide. They are differentiated by generation mix, the share of nuclear and renewables, and by the level of interconnections. Let's look on the horizontal axis first. LTO is our long-term operation scenario with 2.2 gigawatts of capacity from Switzerland's two youngest nuclear plants. And the VRE-only scenario is all the hydro that you saw, and then in addition, a solar PV and a bit of wind to meet demand. Then the three sort of contrasting scenarios: new nuclear, 1.6 and 3.2 gigawatts, and a new gas scenario with 2.0 gigawatts, 2 gigawatts of combined cycle gas turbines at a gas price. We are all experts now in gas pricing, of course, of $50 per megawatt hour, and carbon costs of $100 per ton of CO2. And then we have three levels of interconnection capacity: 100% of current interconnection capacity, i.e. roughly 10 gigawatts, 50%, 5 gigawatts, or autarky. There is a little bit of a discussion in Switzerland on these issues, and so we wanted to explore these different levels of interconnection capacity, and we'll present you the results in the next slide. Again, in the red frame, the two most important scenarios, the LTO and the VRE-only scenario. And then you have the four colors, the four bars. You have the gray bar, which are Swiss domestic costs of running the electricity system. The green on the top is always the sum of connection, grid, and balancing costs, part of the system costs. And then you have the net trade revenues in orange. And if they're below the zero line, that means you make positive trade revenues, negative costs. That's what you gain as an operator of the Swiss electricity system. So then the economic or the total system costs that need to be considered in terms of the welfare of the Swiss economy, that's then the blue bar. The blue bar is green plus gray plus green minus orange gives you the blue bar. And there you see that the cheapest solution is indeed the LTO with 100% of interconnection. It would cost the Swiss population $1.16 billion per year. You then see different numbers: 2.52 for the VR-only with 100% interconnection. If you move towards autarky, the next 5 bars, you would see that costs are considerably higher due to the lack of the flexibility and the gains from trade from the interconnections. And interconnection 50% is really somewhat in the middle, both with respect to the physical costs and with respect to the trade revenues or costs. One thing on the trade revenues, you see in the VRE-only scenarios that you have positive trade costs, i.e. you have to pay in addition also your neighbors in order to provide you with the electricity. These are sort of our overview results, and that sort of structure then everything that comes after that. Let's move on in the interest of time to capacity. We'll do this quickly. Of course, the highest capacity will be in the autarky scenarios, because again, we don't have the resources from the neighboring countries to draw on. As usual, also, I already mentioned it, the low load factors for solar PV and wind mean that the VRE scenarios always have considerably higher capacity. And in addition, in the VRE-only scenario, we also have some batteries coming in order to provide to provide the necessary flexibility. Bill Magwood mentioned that the level of flexibility in Switzerland is very high due to the hydro, in all the scenarios, we can arrive at an equilibrium without drawing on batteries, but with VRE only in autarky, indeed, we need to also build some additional batteries in addition to the hydropower. That would of course be the case in other countries also for other scenarios. I got a question through Andrew, who asks which year are these results for? And these results are for 2050. These are all net zero scenarios for the year 2050, and thank you for that question, allowing me to specify that. These are all net zero scenarios that meet the same level of demand and the same structure of demand in 2050. This is now the production in these different mixes. We see again that in the VRE only under autarky scenario, we not only need batteries, we also need voluntary demand response, i.e. Demand response. And in all trading scenarios, we see that the role of physical electricity imports does remain quite important. We'll go on to the next slide, which is entirely on the flexibility resources. And it's interesting to briefly talk about this. Pump hydro in light blue is sort of really the basis of Swiss flexibility provision. But we have other important providers of flexibility. Batteries were already mentioned. Demand response was already mentioned. In some of the autarky scenarios, we have VRE curtailment. We don't know what to do with the overproduction of solar PV because we can no longer export it. And we also have an important share of hydrogen, 8 terawatt hours for industrial uses. And if you allow hydrogen production to be optimized over time, that also becomes quite an important source of flexibility. An overview, maybe for those of you who are more interested in the details, that would be something to look at in the study. We have an extensive annex that deals with flexibility. Next slide, please. On the gains of trading, very important distinction between physical flows, physical current flows, and net trade revenues, i.e. the income or the costs of trading with your neighbors. And the important thing is to distinguish in blue the physical flows, and we see under all scenarios, Switzerland physically has net imports in all scenarios. But due to its flexibility, in the LTO scenario, for instance, it manages to import cheaply and to sell dearly. Pump storage works on that. We buy electricity when it's cheap, we sell it when it's expensive, and that gives the yellow point with the right-hand axis, with then the net trade revenues in billions of dollars. These are the yellow points. And you see that in the LTO scenario, we have positive physical net imports, but also positive net trade revenues. In the VRE only, we have more net physical imports, but negative costs. I mean, positive costs, net costs, due to the fact that in that case, all the flexibility is needed to compensate for the variability of the solar, and we no longer can take advantage of the differences in price with the surrounding countries. We'll come to a close in the last 2 slides. This is one of these 3D charts. You saw the 3D chart presented by Diane. This is something similar, but in a more simplified version. On the right-hand axis, you have the level of interconnection from 100% of today's level to 0 to autarky. On the left-hand axis, you would have the the capacity of nuclear, either 0, 1.6 with one new nuclear plant, 2.2, the LTO scenario with the lowest cost, and then new nuclear with 3.2 gigawatts. And you have the system cost in billions on the vertical axis. And you can see higher degree of interconnection always reduces system costs, and the LTO is with 100% interconnection capacity is the least cost solution. The VRE only strategy under autarky is almost 5 times more expensive. And we come to our key conclusions, which summarize some of the points that I've already said. First key conclusion is that a scenario based on a mix of VRE sources and long-term operation of the 2 newest nuclear power plants with the current interconnection level, i.e. 100% of current capacity, is the most cost-effective scenario. More broadly, always scenarios that take a mix of renewables and nuclear are always lower in all cases rather than the variable renewables only scenarios. Nevertheless, even when more expensive, the high level of the domestic flexibility resources of nuclear makes a VRE only strategy feasible, technically feasible, as long as the level of interconnection capacity remains at today's level. So technically feasible, but more expensive, a VRE only strategy. On interconnections, higher levels of interconnections with neighboring countries are always more cost effective than and have lower total system costs than lower levels of interconnection. The gains of trade are limited by the size of the market, as Adam Smith would have it. And finally, about a VRE only strategy under autarky. You saw that we needed a lot of specific flexibility resources to make that work already at the technical level. Such a strategy, VRE only and autarky, would not only be very expensive, but would also move the Swiss system away from the resilience and the security of supply, despite the high level of Swiss domestic flexibility resources. That concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. And we will now move to the panel discussion with several of the people that have contributed to the report in a often very important and decisive manner. We thank you very much for joining me here on the virtual roundtable. I will start with Fabienne Schabler. She is an environmental scientist, has a background in biology and geology. She works at Swiss Nuclear, where she is a coordinator for research and education, and as such, of course, directly concerned by the issues of the study. I'll go in alphabetical order just to make it simple. We have Marco Comedo. Marco is an energy economist at the International Atomic Energy Agency, and he works on economics of nuclear power. His main area is indeed the integration of nuclear and renewable energy in low carbon energy systems. And of course, Marco worked for 8 years at the OECD NEA. Here's Marco, and has contributed heavily to the NEA's system cost work before he changed to the IAEA, and he was also a member of the Scientific Advisory Council. Another member of the Scientific Advisory Council was Tom Kober. Tom leads the Energy Economics Group of the Laboratory for Energy Systems Analysis at PSI. And he has a long experience in energy modeling, more than 15 years, and is of course involved in many international national research projects. And his current research is on sustainable energy system in Switzerland and beyond, and the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Tom was also a member of the Scientific Advisory Council. I'm coming to Roger Lundmark. He heads the NPP support at Swiss Nuclear and is the WANO interface officer for Switzerland. He has also been a long-standing partner of the NEA as a representative of Switzerland in the Working Party on Nuclear Energy Economics. Roger has, of course, many years of experience in the nuclear industry, but in this particular context, he was our main interlocutor on the Swiss side, together with Cedric, to whom I come in a minute, for the study. And Roger was instrumental of making this happen. Another person who was instrumental to making this happen was Anne-Laure Mazurich, who works with me at the OECD Nuclear Energy Agency as a nuclear energy analyst. She joined us more than 6 months now, but a long time ago. It seems, although if you look at the months, it's not so long, but she has caught up extremely quickly and really made the study her own. She has a PhD in energy modeling and done at the CA Cadarache and Université Grenoble, in particular on the flexible contribution of nuclear energy in a system with a high share of VRE. So that was a good convergence, which was what was needed for this study. I'm coming to Ralf Straub. Ralf is the head of international affairs for safety and supervision at the Swiss Federal Office of Energy. He is part of the decision makers that will need to make the decisions on the future of the Swiss energy system. He is also a long-standing contact of the NEA because he's a member of the Nuclear Development Committee since many years, and of course has a long career both in industry and in the Swiss administration. Ralf was not directly involved in the study, but was kept informed of it, and we're very grateful that he accompanied it from afar. And then finally, Cedric Vesiguier. He is asset manager in the nuclear power generation business at Alpiq, the Swiss utility, and is in particular responsible for the management of the partner society formed by these three main Swiss utilities together with EDF. So he knows everything about trade flows between France and Switzerland. He holds a PhD in energy modeling from the École Centrale in Paris. And as I said earlier already, together with Roger, he was really very heavily involved, almost at a day-to-day level, but at least at a week-to-week level with Anne-Laure and myself in order to make this study happen. And thank you to all of you. Now, this is, of course, a panel, and I will be able to rest my voice and by passing on the questions to the panelists. I will start with Roger. Roger, your guidance and coordination for providing country-specific data and information was instrumental in bringing the study about. The objective of the report is to offer some robust evidence on the implications for system costs of different energy mixes, which were just presented. Do you think there's an audience for this in Switzerland? And independent of this report, which focused on the economic system costs, what are for you currently the biggest challenges for Swiss nuclear?
Thank you very much, Jan. I hope you can hear me well, and for your presentation before. Yes, and the questions, we have been able to contribute to this study with our data and national expertise, also from the other companies and Swiss Nuclear. So that was a great opportunity for us. And now that I have had the opportunity to study the report in detail, I realized how comprehensive it is and how much in depth it is. And as you said yourself in the beginning, right now the system costs or any energy system, electricity system, and analysis of that is a very relevant subject. And I mean, your report, it does not only cover the 2050 prospective analysis on the net zero under different assumptions, but furthermore, you have done a thorough review of the basic properties of the Swiss electricity system, which I understood, having studied the report, as well as you have, as you also presented the other studies of system costs. You put them in a perspective, and I think that enables. There is a lot in this report for a broad audience, even though they come with different views, different objects, and different backgrounds. So I definitely think there's an opportunity, thanks to not only the in-depth studies, but also the broad how you documented and reported it. So that's the first question. The current challenges for Swiss nuclear, I would like to say it a bit different. I see challenges and opportunities from the Swiss nuclear perspective. I mean, we heard it earlier that we have member companies in Swiss nuclear with unlimited operating licenses for their new nuclear power plants, as long as they're safe and viable and retrofitted on a regular basis, which is, I would say, absolutely an opportunity. On the other hand, Switzerland is stepping out of nuclear due to a political decision, and new reactors are prohibited by law. So that put us in a situation where we need to think about managing, developing the competence, getting new young professionals interested in our field, and that takes a lot of engagement and ownership, where Swiss nuclear obviously plays a role facilitating and support initiatives in cooperation with our member stations and companies. But this is not, of course, not only for the operational period, but for the period beyond the waste management and the commissioning. And the other point where I see where we need to be vigilant and continue driving initiatives is to support a healthy supply chain for the long-term operations of the stations.
Thank you very much, Roger, for this sort of background picture. And we'll do a little bit more background, and we'll move perhaps a little bit more towards some modeling questions. But I would in particular like to ask Ralf Straub. Can you tell us something about the current situation regarding energy policy making in Switzerland? Like, for people who are not Swiss, the frequent popular initiatives are quite unusual. Do they make policy making more difficult, or does it make it easier? Because we noted that the debate in Switzerland was unusually lively, engaged, informed, which is great. It's not the case in all countries. A great number of competent studies being around. So, in short, how does the current Swiss policymaking framework work in terms of realizing net zero ambitions?
Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Jan, and thank you for this valuable insights as you presented right away. So regarding your question, the energy policy in Switzerland, I mean, the current situation, you know all of them. So it's triggered by the war in Ukraine. So we have a global energy crisis, and this affects Switzerland as well. Under this impression, so we decided to, of course, we have to strengthen the security of supply. And this is a joint effort. It's not only from the government, it's also from the industry, it's also from the public, from the cantons, from the cities, from the municipalities. So there are a lot of stakeholders to work together in this, that we can guarantee the energy supply during these times, especially during the winter times. So we developed various measures that we can create reserves, reduce dependence on oil and gas, and also strengthen the domestic renewable energies. So, for example, I will pick up two. We have the hydropower reserve, which we strengthen also. We will build up reserve power plants. Maybe you are aware about it from General Electric. So either of mobile power plants to at least to produce in total 250 megawatts electricity if something will happen. So then we have a lot of other measures. So this is the actual situation. Then, of course, I would say our foundation, what is over the years developed, and this is about the energy strategy. I mean, that's also very known, but I would like also to re-mention again. So we have our energy strategy 2050, which came into force from 2080 and was updated or with the energy perspectives 2050 plus last year, which the aim to have in 2050 a net zero emission scenario. And this is, of course, this energy system to support the climate goal of net zero greenhouse gas emissions. Currently, we are more or less on this side. But you know, also the decision from the energy strategy is to phase out on a step-by-step basis from nuclear energy. And this is our current act. And we will phase out from nuclear energy as long, for the next years. The nuclear power plants, they can operate as long they are safe. So, this energy perspectives 50 plus is, of course, dominated by renewables, by hydrogen, by other sources. Maybe the second question about the unusual frequent popular initiatives. I mean, this is part of our tradition. We have a direct democracy in Switzerland. This is very unique. And this system allows a very, I would say, a very strong interaction between the government, between the public, between the decision makers. And this is, I would say, a very good framework to bring decisions on a broad acceptance to the public or and also to the best benefit of to the country. As I said, the long-term energy policy is, besides the actual law, not changed. So we will closely follow them with the energy strategy 2050 and the energy perspective 2050 plus. So regarding as you mentioned, the second question, if I remember correctly, the framework will be not changing. So from that point of view, we will go our way, but of course we have to take into account what's currently taking place in the world as the energy crisis, and we will have our aim is to secure the energy supply which is affordable, of course, which is clean over the next years, and to come to this goal in 2050, we have a net zero global emissions of energy source. Yeah.
Very good. So despite short-term challenges,
Exactly.
The long-term objectives remain the same.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll come a little bit more to the modeling part and to the study. I would like to start with Marco, who knows this area of research very well. Marco, how does this report compare to the state of the art in system cost analysis? I mean, with more resources, you can always do more, and we had the resources we had and went as far as we could. But if you look at other ongoing work, how would you rank this study, and which would be the main areas of improvement if we had it again? You never have that opportunity, of course, but where in the future we would need to sort of look at what are the parts that would need further improvement?
Yeah, thank you, Jan, for your question. Generally speaking, I would say that system cost studies are very challenging. You know that very well, because the underlying models are extremely complex. They depend a lot on data, and somehow you cannot expect to be able to model and to represent all the aspect of the power system, especially if we want, as we want, to represent also the interaction with the with the whole energy system. Those difficulties are even bigger in the specific case of Switzerland, due to the large interconnection, as you mentioned, and also the significant share of hydroelectric capacity. So one of the main challenges that we as Scientific Advisory Council have faced was in my view to define which was the future energy mix of neighboring countries and how to represent correctly the power flows from and to Switzerland with neighboring countries. One last thing that I want to stress also here is that the value of those kind of system cost studies doesn't lie much in looking at one of the scenarios analyzed in isolation, but rather in comparing the different scenarios and in understanding what are the implications of policy choices. So in a nutshell, I think that the POSY model, the NEA model that have been used for the system cost study for Switzerland is definitely able to capture the most important aspect of the possible future net zero system for Switzerland, and definitely is perfectly fit for the objective of the study, which we have to remember are dedicated to policymakers. So this is the audience of the study. In terms of message, I find that the message from the Swiss system study are well aligned with those of many other studies that have looked at potential pathways toward net zero. I found quite a lot of similarity with the study performed by RTE, the French system operator, which was an extremely detailed and well model study on the French system. The study is called Future Énergétique 2050, and I found that overall the conclusion of both studies are definitely in a good agreement, despite the difference on the two systems. So, with respect to your last question, which looks at area of improvement, I would suggest, or I would wish to have two or three points, as you say. You cannot have it all with energy system modeling, but okay, I think having a fully integrated European model, which represent in very much detail the interplay between European region and in particular the impact of different energy policies in Europe would have been a good improvement. On the other aspect, it's rather technical, but consider and effectively represent several meteorological years, as this becomes increasingly important with high shares of renewable resources, because the system becomes more and more difficult, and then you need to have to look at several years. And finally, I mean, I'm focusing on myself at this thing at the IAEA. I would be really interested in better understand and model the contribution of nuclear to decarbonize the whole energy system, in particular to represent well how it could help with heat production and the coupling with hydrogen. So with that, I think is pretty much what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marco. Well, it should be a pleasure to continue working on these topics together with you and others, such as Tom. Just the RTE study, we are of course dreaming of having a fraction of the resources that they had in their study, which is an excellent study. But and I agree with you, and thanks for making that comparison, which definitely sort of validates our approach. Tom, I'm moving over to you. Also, you are, of course, very experienced modelers. You have provided us with significant data, knowledge, advice, and many thanks for that. However, I would like to ask you a non-technical question, more sort of drawing on your inside knowledge of the Swiss energy modeling and policymaking. Our two key scenarios, LTO of the two youngest nuclear power plants, or indeed VRE only, primarily solar PV, were they the right ones? Are they the ones that really sort of structure the issues in a way that makes them helpful for the Swiss policy discussions. And I have a follow-up question, which is, both scenarios require a number of assumptions. Let's assume that none of these assumptions actually is realized. We'll neither get LTO nor VRE only. What would then happen? What would then happen sort of by default? Tom?
You want me to have a look in the crystal ball?
Yes, well, that's why we're here. No?
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, Jan. So from a perspective of the electricity sector, I think the scenarios with a lifetime long-term operation and with a variable renewable energies, specifically PV, they are well chosen. So PV is the renewable energy with the highest potential in Switzerland. And yes, since the lifetime of the operation of existing nuclear power plants is on the condition of their safety. So yes, we can think about many different different schemes, and that means, in my view, these kind of scenarios are well chosen and very relevant. Of course, as a scenario modeler, I can say yes, we can always think of many other scenarios as well. But I think for the electricity sector, they are very relevant. When it comes to, that addresses your second question, what would happen if nothing of this materializes? Maybe I can briefly build a little bit with my explanation on scenario studies that we have been performing at PSI, Laboratory of Energy Systems Analysis. And there we also looked at what happens if we have a delay in the deployment of cost-effective options. And that these kind of scenarios cause the highest system costs. So that means we will need many different electricity generation options, because electrification is the most important, electrification of demand is the most important mean to substitute fossil fuels in the demand sectors. So that means deploying heat pumps, moving to e-mobility. Also in the industry sector, electricity can play an increasing role. And from that perspective, electricity is a key fuel in future. And if we have not proper and cost competitive options to produce electricity in place, that causes extremely high costs, because we would need to kind of achieve climate change mitigation with other means, increased energy efficiency improvement, maybe more energy imports, but these would be certainly very expensive energy imports, maybe clean synthetic fuels or hydrogen, which are very important. So that's why having low-cost electricity options available in Switzerland is extremely beneficial.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting that you say that this sort of electrification as a specific topic, both how do you satisfy the electricity production and which transfers do you have through sector coupling are key questions. Thank you. We'll perhaps come back to it in other contexts, but thank you. Fabienne, you work a lot on research and also on education, and as we say in French, on formation. I mean, so sort of what are the competences, whether they are available. And the LTO scenario assumes a long-term operation of the nuclear power plants to 60 years and above. How easy is it to motivate today young people in Switzerland to enter the nuclear energy industry in a context of uncertain lifetimes, because we don't know whether this will really come to happen. So what's a little bit the situation there on the human capital, on the competence front, in order to make the LTO scenario possible?
Yeah, thank you for your question. So I think this is a very important topic for us, and I think the decision to step out from nuclear energy had an influence on the motivation of young people to join the nuclear energy. But we have seen in the recent years also a a kind of a rebound of interest for nuclear energy from the part of the students. So this is very, very positive for us. And what we also need to communicate as an industry is that we still have many more years of operation, like Leibstadt will be operating for 20 years or more, and we still need the people also during the decommissioning time and after. So there are still opportunity, there is still work in the nuclear power plants, and there is a long-term perspective for the people who wants to enter the industry now. And at Swiss Nuclear, what we do to support the young generation, we support research and education at an academic level. And like that, we have a kind of a pool of young people that could be future collaborator in the nuclear power plants. And so this way we keep also the competence active and interesting also for young people. And another very important cohort for us, of course, are the reactor operators. And we want to make sure that they have a very high quality education, and with education that is recognized with a federal diploma. So which this way we have a bit more attractive education. And of course, we also participate in different activities to kind of build a bridge between the industry and the students, because personal contacts are very important. So, so yes, in summary, it is a challenge to motivate young people to enter the industry, but with also with good project, we can have also we get a lot of very highly qualified people.
Thank you very much for this. At the same time, realistic and nevertheless optimistic message that the competences will be there and the opportunities for somebody to enter for a young person are there also. With that, I would like to move to Anne-Laure Mazurich. Anne-Laure, you have worked with Guillaume Krivchik, who's no longer at the NEA, most closely involved with actually running the NEA POSY model. What were, according to you, the main challenges that you encountered in the actual modeling of the Swiss energy sector? Electricity exchanges, the absence of variable costs, or the interaction of flexibility resources? What was your approach in overcoming them?
Thank you very much, Jan, for your question, which gives me the opportunity to thank again Guillaume for his deep work and effort in the modeling step of the study at the early stage, actually. And he benefited also from the input of Cedric mainly and Roger to collect all the data needed to use POSY and also to get the full picture of how the Swiss system works. So there is actually a lot of challenges, as you said, in the modeling, but I think the most important for me is a modelization of interconnection at the same level with hydro, but I think I won't have time because we are running out of time, so I cannot go into detail of this one. And so it's interconnection, and the challenge is actually twofold, because there is on one side the modeling of the exchange at the border, the actual exchange at the border, and there is also the fact that the Swiss price relies on the interconnection. So if I go first with the modeling of the interconnection, we have to differentiate first the physical versus the commercial flows. So the physical flows actually are the real amount of electricity which goes through the interconnection cable or lines. And on the other side, you have the commercial flow, which is the agreement between Switzerland and its 4 neighboring countries, and this has to be fulfilled like annually or every day. And to do this, we used what is called the net transfer capacities, or shortened as NTC, and at each time step, so each hour, POSY has to fulfill, has to not exceed the net transfer capacities. So this is the way we decided to model the interconnection. And as you see, this is very important, and it's more important because the Swiss price calculation is very unique, and you cannot rely on the cost marginal approach. You have to, because the thing is, Switzerland relies on a lot of hydropower, as you said during the presentation, but you have also the nuclear is only base load and the gas contribution is very low. So you cannot use the marginal cost. So therefore, the Swiss price is calculated with the interconnection and with the price of the other country, the neighboring country. So the price is equal to the price at the latest interconnection open with the lowest price. And this is how it was calculated. And thanks to the Scientific Advisory Council, I have to say, and we were very confident at the end for the modeling of POSY to have a good realism in all the scenario we went through. So thank you for the question.
Thank you very much, Anne-Laure. Unfortunately, we're a little bit running out of time, and I'm the first who's responsible for that. And we could discuss these questions for a long time, and we have, but it's still not done. We'll move quickly on to Cédric. And Cédric Rosier, this will be the last intervention. Perhaps you can wrap up in 3-4 minutes, and then Roger will wrap up in 3-4 minutes. We are allowed to go a little bit over time, but not very much. But we should say what we need to say. So Cédric, you've been very closely involved in almost all aspects of the study, especially on the data side. And one major challenge was something that you know very well at ALPIC. It was the modeling of the large, complex, and closely interconnected Swiss hydro facilities. Were we successful in dealing with that? How could we perhaps improve still on this modeling of hydro, which is all important in Switzerland? Cédric.
Yes, Jan, it was one of the first challenge of the modeling, and I don't know if it was the biggest. Andor talked about the other issue with interconnection and prices, but the modelization of hydro is crucial because, of course, it's the big part of the production in the electric mix in Switzerland. How we did that, we were actually quite lucky because there are lots of information and data given on the website of the Swiss Federal Office of Energy. There is a list, exhaustive list of all the hydro facility of the country. And basically from that list, we decided to make 3 groups to represent the 3 kind of hydropower facilities: the runoff rivers, the accumulation, and the pump storage. This is, of course, a simplification of all the hydropower system because there are water channel between each other, and there are some lakes, reservoir, pump storage facility communicating together. So, of course, we had to do some simplification, but I am quite confident with the way it has been done and with the results of the modelization. Especially with the check that we did with the water level. This is something that you have shown during the presentation. And I think that was important. We have been really looking for a way to check and to prove that the way we have modelized it was good. And I think we succeeded in doing that, even if it could have been better. And what could have been done better, it's probably to increase the level of description of the hydro facility and to make some subgroups inside the groups. And so probably you will reach a better representation, but this is something that could be done later or further if further investigation are needed.
Thank you very much, Cédric, with a final encouraging remark. That concludes not the webinar, because we'll now move over to Roger for the concluding remarks, but it concludes the roundtable as such. And I will conclude it by saying thank you very much, not only for your contribution to the study, but also to the roundtable. There are many, many important, deep, and interesting topics still to be discussed. And I look forward to doing that in the future with you. Thank you very much. Over to you, Roger, please, for the conclusion.
Wonderful, Jan. Thank you very much. As a matter of fact, there's not a lot to say, but I still want to repeat a little bit what the news I took during the individual quests here. And Ralph started off, and I think Ralph realized that the democracy that helps finding solutions, and they are acceptable at the end, and there is an intensive debate, Ralph. And I also mentioned that the long-term objectives are unchanged in Switzerland, which is also a typical Swiss thing, not to change things too quickly. Marco, I go to you then. Marco, you mentioned that it's very good to use one model to compare different versions, different alternatives with the model, but rather not compare the models, different models with each other too much. And you have a dream, and that is the area for improvement. That's the fully integrated European model. That's still to be done, and I guess they need some sponsor to get that model working. Tom, your contribution made us confident. We understood that we probably chose the right alternatives with the PV in the VRE case and the long-term operation of the nuclear. And we also understood that it is not good not to do anything, because it only gets more and more costly, because you need to look for other climate change mitigations by other means if you don't get the things installed as planned. Fabian, you looked out and realized that, and mentioned that 60+ is an opportunity for the industry, for Swiss Nuclear to grasp. And we have several initiatives from Swiss Nuclear and the Swiss industry to continue making our industry attractive for young professionals. And Laure, I will remember the net transfer capability, which you mentioned. It was very exciting coming up with that, doing the analysis there, and thank you very much for that. And Cedric, your statement at the end mentioning that you think that you have to do the right simplifications when you model hydro, and I think you came to the conclusion that we did the right simplifications, or the NEA did the right simplifications. We were, of course, monitoring this in our work. So that's basically my conclusion of this extremely interesting work, where we had the opportunity to supply a lot of data, information, and feedback to the OECD NEA to come up with this very exciting report, which is worth reading. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to all of our panelists, and thank you to all of you who've listened in. We appreciate your participation, and we especially appreciate all your questions. Today's event has been recorded and will be available on the NEA website soon. The report is now live on our website. You can download it from the link that you can see in front of you, www.oecd-nea.org/7631, or just visit our homepage and you'll find it from there. You can also follow the NEA on Twitter and LinkedIn to keep in touch with us and receive updates on our programs and events like this one. Thank you. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. This concludes our webinar, and the Zoom session will now be closing.